Welcome to our 2014 annual Halloween tour of the Our Lady Queen of Heaven Cemetery, Catholic Cemetery in San Luis Obispo, California. We'll be going down through the main part of the cemetery, ending up in the mausoleum at the crypt of noted San Luis Obispo pioneer merchant Louis. So more to follow. This cemetery is not the original Catholic cemetery in San Luis Obispo. The oldest cemetery was for the Native Americans who lived in this area. Some call them Northern Chumash, but increasingly ethnologists like myself are realizing that there was a blend of people here, Yokuts from the Central Valley, Solinans from the north, Chumash from the south who came here, and that's what made the language so unusual. People would come up here from Santa Barbara and the Native Americans would say, well, they speak a different language from us. Even the name for Morro Rock, Liamisu, is unique to these people around here and forms part of a Solinan prayer. If any of you were up at Mission San Antonio last Saturday for our Mass for the Day of the Dead, you heard Solinan prayers that included prayer to looking for our ancestors from Liamisu, from the top of Morro Rock. We can see our ancestors because they believed the ancestors went to sea. And so their burials were almost always down by Port San Luis in the cliffs up above Diablo, where you have the entrance to Diablo Canyon as you drive on out to the old Port Inn. There were a number of graves there. When the railroad, the Pacific Coast Narrow Gauge Railroad, which had its terminal right over here, went out there in 1878, they whacked right through those graves. And so many of those skeletons were just dumped into the sea. Liz and I were a part of the repatriation of several of those skeletons. They were found in an English medical college. A man here who was the first librarian in San Luis was a friend of an Episcopal priest, so he let the Episcopal priest take these skulls and other bones back to England with him, and they were discovered in the drawer there, and they came back. When the missionaries came in, they established a cemetery right next to San Luis Obispo Mission, between the mission and going across Chorro Street. And there were approximately 4,000 graves there. People were buried in common graves. They would dig a trench, usually 9 to 12 feet deep. They would bury the first rack of people, and people died in waves in those days because of epidemics that would pass through. The Native Americans had no immunities to the common cold, to measles, chicken pox, and mumps and other things. And when something like that would go through, you would have maybe 100, 150 deaths. So you dug a common grave, put the person in the grave, threw some quicklime over it. You've seen the movie Amadeus, I presume. That's how Mozart was buried. The quicklime cuts down the germs, begins the dissolving of the body. Little earth over that, another layer, and another layer. Well, when they dug through Chorro Street, beginning in the 1890s, they went right through those graves. And people were inattentive to any kind of respect for the dead. The church complained about it, but nothing got done. But the Catholics realized they needed a new cemetery. So they moved the cemetery over to land that was owned by the church near Marsh and Chorro. Well, Marsh lived up to its name. In this land of little rain until it rains, right? And the graves flooded. And by the 1860s, the priest at the old mission determined that they better go to higher land. And the Munoz family, the Quintana family, or who are buried here and such, donated some land. The church acquired title to this area that we're in here. Unfortunately, they sold the prime land over along Higuera Street, depriving us of an entrance to this cemetery from Higuera Street, which is rather tragic. All that money went to San Francisco to build the old St. Mary's Cathedral. and it left kind of an isolated plot of land, but the church fathers didn't mind because this added a sort of element of privacy. And you know, you have to look to get into this place, don't you? It takes some exploration. But the graves that were next to the mission were moved again. Marsh Street flooded out, and then Captain Dana was moved 3 times until he finally got here. We'll be looking at his grave later on. They dug him up. I don't know if they opened the coffin or not, but they dug him up, and they moved the grave each time and moved it here. Finally, in the late 1860s, early 1870s, all the graves were ultimately moved, and this cemetery began. And so we have the oldest cemetery in San Luis Obispo here, the one across the street called the Oddfellows Cemetery. The Oddfellows were actually a burial society. The International Order of Oddfellows, IOOF, and we just led a tour of the mother lode for our mission docents, and we saw a lot of IOOF meeting halls and such. If you were a card-carrying member of that group, it entitled you to burial. And so in the Old West, you didn't know where you were going to die, but it was very good to be reassured that you would have a burial simply by the possession of that card or by somebody knowing that you were an Oddfellow. There's going to be a twist to that, but we'll hold off for the end of the tour to see that twist. That cemetery started shortly after this one, and it's rather curious to me that cemeteries are almost always on the south side of towns. Have you ever noticed that? As you drive up to the Salinas Valley, you see the Greenfield Cemetery and the Soledad Cemetery. They're all on the south side of the town. That's because of the general presumption that rivers and creeks flow to the south. So the water goes through the town before it goes near the cemetery. Now, the odd thing when I look at that beautiful little Greenfield Cemetery, which is the most decorated cemetery in California because the Mexican people really love to put flowers on the grave and everything else, which direction does the Salinas River flow? From the south to the north. It varies that. But as they say in Greenfield, the Salinas never floods here. It floods further to the north, but not there particularly. But this one was the south, and that made the city fathers very happy to get the bodies out of town to prevent the spread of disease. And once again, we're seeing with the Ebola epidemic how fearful people get about that. The nice thing about this cemetery is that the gravestones here represent the kind of piety that you have in the late Victorian period, where you tried to emulate the spiritual aspect of death, but also something else that most of us don't think about today. So many people are cremated, and you get a little plate over, if you're lucky, maybe you don't need it, but where your ashes are interred. Or if you're put in the ground for convenience of landscape maintenance, you have an absolutely flat surface on the ground. The 19th century was all caught up with Egyptology. There was a rediscovery of Egypt when Napoleon went into Egypt in 1798, and he took with him a number of illustrators who brought all these magnificent things of the pyramids, the tombs of the dead in the Valley of the Dead and such, and monumentalism became a Victorian practice. And so the graves reflected your status in life. Pharaoh gets the biggest, but the middle class still wanted to be a little bit like Pharaoh, so they wanted monuments also. They also wanted those monuments to tell you a little bit about who that person was. And different societies have taken that to different lengths. Liz and I led a tour once of Highgate Cemetery in London, which is in the north of London, there you would see tombs that were actual pyramids, like the Dorn Pyramid we have here in the Oddfellows Cemetery, representing Mr. Dorn's Masonic associations. He was the Grand Master of the Freemasons order. but you would also see Greek pillars and very elaborate tombstones and such. Sometimes you would even see an arrangement that reflected the office of a judge, for example, like sort of a throne with a bench in front of it. And that could be carried to extreme. In Russia, in the communist period, and of course they were officially atheistic, but when you go through some of the Moscow cemeteries, as Liz and I have, you have people's offices reproduced, where they have their desk, they have the chair for the poor person sitting in front of you, and a big portrait of the person there. The Victorians did that to a degree, and let's take a look at some of the statements they make in their graves. The plot laid out for the Miosi family. The Miosis were Swiss Italians who came to manage the dairy industry of the county, which evolved after 1865. In the mid-1860s, there had been a terrible drought that killed off almost all of the mission cattle. Clever investors came down from the Bay Area and began to buy land, often just for the taxes owed on it. They reckoned that San Luis Obispo had once been a land of green grasses, and it would be again. And the dairy industry just boomed in this area, so that San Luis Obispo became the leading dairy-producing region in the entire world in the 1870s. And there was a lot of money. But that money was dependent on turning the milk into something that could be shipped. There was no way of shipping refrigerated milk in those days. So what two categories could milk come in outside of powdered, where it would hold up against daytime temperatures? Cheese and butter. Now, we all know how to make butter. We've probably made it in kindergarten. Remember, you shake a jar of cream and it turns into butter. But cheese making is a real art. And the owners of these dairies offered premiums to people in the Azore Islands and in Canton Ticino in Switzerland to come here to make cheese. They paid them well enough so that after 2 or 3 years, a good cheesemaker could say, well, boss, it's been wonderful knowing you. I saved enough money to go and buy my own plot of land. Does that sound familiar too? That's what a lot of other immigrant families do in America. Probably your family, I know that's what my family did. It's a way of moving up in the world, and we hope that that mobility stays with America, because that's what makes us really great, isn't it? Former employee can become the employer someday. And the Miosis quickly became able to do that. Tullio Olivio Miosi, and as you see, he died at a very, very tender age. The little angel there, holding the flowers, it's been much deteriorated over the years. But poor Tullio was given a bicycle for, I believe it was his 5th birthday. He lost control of it, split his head wide open. It was a flesh wound. They stitched it back together. But this is the age before antibiotics. Infections set in, and he died a rather gruesome death. And so the family wanted to commemorate that with an angel. And to me, that is much better than the desk in Moscow. It makes a statement of the total innocence. Now, the other thing that you're going to notice are the concrete crypts. Everyone was afraid of the deterioration of the body. If you're Roman Catholic, like Liz and I are, we say every Sunday in the Apostles' Creed that we believe in the resurrection of the body. And that caused no end of confusion, even amongst the church fathers. They had a hard time getting that straight, and they were opposed to cremation for a long time, because how do you resurrect the body? Well, when you had Monsignor telling you that repeatedly, and you're saying it in Latin originally in church, which most people couldn't understand, you took it seriously. And so you wanted to protect the body against deterioration. And they went to all sorts of lengths to try to achieve that protection. With the introduction of poured stone, which is what they originally called concrete, they thought they had something that was impervious. Well, it's about as impervious as anything else. I mean, water would go right through, and you can see what's happening to almost all of these concrete vaults. Also, they were very deep. Usually the father of the family would die, and then they would they wouldn't put earth over it, they would just lower the coffin in, and then they would raise it again and put the wife or whatever in that successive order, so they were reusable. And that's sort of, you know, environmentalism as a mode of the Central Coast. They were practicing it early on. As Harold Miosi, who was my cantankerous friend for many years, and a great benefactor of Cuesta College and of environmentalism in here. I said, well, Harold, obviously your ancestors were environmentalists. And he said, Dan, I'm not going to kid you, they were just cheap. They didn't want to pay for any more land in the cemetery, but nonetheless, it's there. So these are called open crypts, as differentiated from the little mausoleums that you see through here also. On the other side, over here, you're going to see a whole string of Portuguese-American families. If you can see a photograph, that was common too. Once photographs emerged beyond the original daguerreotype, they could put an image of the founding father of the family. All of these gravestones, by the way, are from non-local material. They were done up in San Francisco. If you've ever been to the City of the Dead, just south of San Francisco, where all the burials are, there's a monument company that made most of these monuments. They were taken by ship to Port San Luis and brought in here. If you thought you were going to die, you might have your gravestone pre-cut up there, so it was here ready for you, and just the final date would be chipped in here. But otherwise, it was prepared and brought down here for you. If there was a mistake in the gravestone, well, you were stuck with it, because it would, you know, they would not take them back. And we have some interesting letters in the county historical collection of the County History Center of people who were complaining, but that there was never any satisfaction. The gravestones remain here with the errors on them.
IHS, what does that mean?
There are two different theories of what it means. One is that it is the name of Jesus. The other is in hoc signo. The Latin expression, I-N-H-O-C-S-I-G-N-O, in this sign, and of course that sign is the cross. That's what Constantine, the emperor, saw before the Battle of Milvian Bridge in a dream, and he thought if his soldiers carried it in battle the next day they would win, and they did. And the Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. See that IHS very often on graves, wherever there's a cross. Marshall family was very, very prominent in San Luis Obispo history. Manuel Marshall was sometimes the acting sheriff of San Luis Obispo. He was also the first jewelry store owner. If you had a piece of jewelry, a good watch or something that you'd inherited from your father, and you were desperate, you could go in and trade it off. Well, Manuel Marshall got fantastically rich doing that. So rich that he was afraid to deal with any San Luis Obispo bank. The people would find out how rich he was, and then he might be kidnapped. So what he would do was to load all the cash in carpet bags, just you know, the old cloth-covered bags, and hop on a stage to take it up to banks in San Francisco. Unfortunately, the bank that he banked with burnt down in the fire, and so he lost over half his fortune in records that were destroyed. So, you know, it was not the best way to do things. But his adventures are a real Old West kind of story. And here he is, buried in a fairly modest grave for a man of his wealth. The Harrington family that we just passed were, again, Irish who came into the United States as a way of getting out of Ireland. They came to San Luis Obispo County and went into banking. And so they were able to buy a grave plot very, very early. They were very active in the rebuilding of Mission Church in 1897. a temporary bell tower was built, most of that money came from Irish families here in the parish. The Harringtons, the Fitzgeralds, and others contributed to that. They wanted to be able to hear the bells. Catholics did not suffer the persecutions and discriminations that the Catholics in Ireland were still suffering, and they very, very bright people. One became a Jesuit priest. Father Shipsey at Santa Clara University was famous as one of the most learned men in California. Another one came to San Luis Obispo, William Shipsey, born in Ireland in 1851, and he became the leading attorney in San Luis Obispo. But the secret history of both William Shipsey and his Jesuit brother was that they were secret contributors to the Irish Republican Army. As I do more and more research assisted by members of their family, I'm finding out they were probably the #1 family in California pushing for the independence of Ireland, which was eventually achieved in 1921. Santa Clara University, you could be Portuguese or Italian Swiss, but when you came out of one of Father Shipsey's classes, you were Irish. On the other side, we see another banker, the Fitzgerald family. They were attorneys and bankers. The Fitzgeralds were starters of what became Security Pacific Bank, located where Fanny Wrappers is now located in San Luis Obispo. And their home was just up at the corner of Choro and Bouchon Street, a very, very elegant colonial style home. And other members of the family were leading attorneys locally and such. You can see the kind of grave stone that they put in. It looks a bit like a bank, doesn't it? Really secure. It's not this. Nobody, no Cal Poly student in Halloween night's going to come in and try to make off with that stone. They wanted you to know that their bank was safe, and so were their graves. And lesson well learned.
So White brought it all the way up on the hill.
That was related to say that this is holy ground, and so people often those crosses. I was pointing out at Mission San Antonio, there's a cross high up on one of the jagged hills above the mission on the other side of San Antonio Creek, and they often use those for pilgrimage during Lent. And people who have something to repent would crawl up on their hands and knees and touch that cross and seek the blessing and forgiveness of God for whatever sins they have done. I've never been quite that desperate, but I probably should have. The Weinman family were originally dry goods merchants, and they were related to the family of Benjamin Foxen. You know Foxen Canyon? If you haven't taken that turn off to cut over to the Santa Ynez Valley, sometime just you go east of Santa Maria. Once you're across the bridge, go east, and you'll follow up through Seasclock, which is a Native American word, a Salinan word, and just follow that along Foxen Canyon Road, and you'll see the old Foxen adobe, which was owned by the Weinemans, who were their descendants. That was the way, the path that John C. Fremont followed in 1846 to avoid an ambush from the Californios, and Benjamin Foxen, Benjamino Foxen, as he was called by the Spanish, by the Mexicans, led them along that. The Mexicans were so angry later on that they burnt his house, but he got even by building that very elegant adobe. And the last living descendant, direct descendant of the Weinemans, gave us a tour of that adobe, about 30 years ago, Lizzie, wasn't it? I'd mentioned his home in an article, and he called me very mad. He said, "I don't want any attention drawn to my home. You know, one's been burnt down already." I said, Mr. Weineman, that's a long time ago. He said, "Well, if you promise never to mention it again in my lifetime, I'll give your people a tour." And he did. He's gone now, so I can mention it. Cemetery. The Dalladé family had its origins when Pierre Hippolyte was growing up in France during the Industrial Revolution. And it was a time very much like America today, where there just weren't any opportunities for young men. Some of the young men turned to political radicalism, and there were constant riots that the French army had to put down. The King of France, Louis Philippe, decided the best thing to do was to draft every young man over the age of 16 and send him abroad in the army, getting rid of the problem. And Dalladé was one of these. He went into the Armée d'Outre-mer, the overseas army. He pulled pretty good duty when you consider the options. There was Algeria and the Sahara Desert, and then there was Papeete, Tahiti. He got the latter. And he also learned a trade. He became a highly skilled carpenter. And so when his enlistment was up, he was told, you can either go back to France by way of the Cape of Good Hope around Africa, or you can go by way of California, and may the Lord help your soul to get home. Well, already word had leaked to Papeete, Tahiti. It was 1848. Gold had been discovered in California, and carpenters were very much in demand here. And he eventually gets to the gold fields, makes a fair amount of money. When he arrived in San Luis Obispo, he had as much as $20,000 in gold with him, which is a huge amount in those days. He got word that the group he was going to join in Mexico had been annihilated by the Mexican government. It was a group of Frenchmen who planned to take over Mexico. No wonder they were annihilated. And so he would tell people years and years later, and he lived well into the 20th century, that he reckoned that the Lord above meant for him to stay in San Luis Obispo. And he stayed here. He was able to buy the old mission vineyard. And with grape cuttings that he got from the French consulate in San Francisco, he grafted high-quality French grapes onto the old mission grapes and was producing upwards of 50,000 gallons of wine a year, and it was extremely good quality wine. The only thing for him was that he could not ship it economically out of here. It cost much more to ship a bottle of wine to San Francisco than the wine cost to produce. The bottles cost a lot of money because they weren't made locally, so he was ahead of his time. But he is truly one of the 2 or 3 fathers of the California wine industry. And here he's buried in our cemetery. The family eventually lost all of its money, could not even pay taxes on the adobe. My dear late friend and mentor, Peter Andre, found out the county was going to take over the adobe, and it was saved by making a donation to the County Historical Society, and that's why we have that beautiful adobe today. But here lies Pierre Hippolyte and some of his children in this particular grave plot. Quintana people were Mexican-American who came in at the very end of the mission period. And they were given several land grants in this area, people who contributed mightily to the making of our region. The Quintana who is buried right here in this grave was the first person who suggested a paved road over the Cuesta. And think what it was like before paved roads up over that pass. And you can see something much more elaborate was in mind here with the multicolored marble pavers and such. And a very, very influential family who wanted people to know they were influential. This was their way of making a statement. It's also, as I said, a form of prayer, saying, we're here for you, we'll be here for a long time. Our descendants into the umpteenth generation will be buried on this site. Back to some real history. Miguel Antonio Avila. He owned the lower part of San Luis Obispo Creek and had an adobe down there back in as early as 1831, 1832. As you can see, he was born in 1796. It's one of the older births here in the cemetery. Liz and I were very close friends of the Portuguese Avila family, of Frank Avila, who was the first instructor at Cuesta College and was the last military and first civilian governor of the Mariana Islands, just one of the most saintly, wonderful men. And Frank's family had land in Sea Canyon. And he said, Dan, when you're writing your articles, please don't confuse me with this guy. And there's a reason. Hubert Howe Bancroft, for whom the Bancroft Library is named, and wrote this multi-volume set of histories of California where you find almost everything, said this is the meanest man in California. And everything that, as a historian, when I started writing my column 31 years ago, I decided I didn't want to hurt anybody. He has no direct living descendants, so I guess I'm not hurting him, but I've never found a kind word about him anywhere. Walter Murray, who founded the paper I write for, arrived here in 1853. The ship brought him into what is now Port San Luis, and the captain said it's too rough to take you ashore. You're going to have to swim ashore yourself, and which is essentially what he did. And then the captain threw the mail bags down to him. Here, you could take these. This guy emerges from a stormy sea, and there's Manuel Avila rubbing his hands, saying, so much for a night, for a warm room, for a meal, and I'll rent you a horse for $100. And Murray writes, he was a stringer for the San Francisco paper, the Alta California. He wrote it about, and he mentions Manuel Avila, and so it goes. He dies in 1871. Just in time for Murray to start buying from his descendants, and almost entirely disappears from the history of San Luis Obispo County. Father Jim Nesbitt always says, don't judge anyone. You never know anything is possible with God, so he's buried here, and for better or for worse. Luigi Murray was born in Liguria in Italy. Do you know where Liguria is? It's near Genoa. And a lot of the Ligurians came to California during the gold rush and after as hard rock miners. If you've been to Genoa, you know the city's built in different valleys with these rocky outcroppings in between their tunnels going through to connect different parts. They knew how to deal with boring through rock, and that was essential to the industrial stage of gold mining, and especially in the Comstock lode for silver mining. He got here in California in the 1860s, just at the end of the Civil War, and suddenly the price of silver and the price of gold went down as America went on what we called the greenback standard, paper money. And so there wasn't a whole lot of work for him. He began to cook, and he was a magnificent cook. And he came to San Luis Obispo, liked the town, liked the little seaport, and realized that the people here were entirely dependent on that seaborne connection to the highway that was all along the Pacific Ocean. And so he opened a little hotel. He bought a little bit of land at the mouth of San Luis Obispo Creek from the Avila family, from Miguel Avila, and built a little hotel. The dairy farmers in the late 1860s sometimes had to wait 2 or 3 days for the coastal packet steamers to come in to pick up their cheese and their butter and such. And so they would stay in his hotel. It became very popular. He ended up buying more and more land from the Avila family, eventually bought a huge portion that included Diablo Canyon all the way over to there. And became one of the wealthiest men in San Luis. He built a hotel that was had at least a California-wide reputation for great food, right where the harbor master's offices are well, they're no longer there, where the baños now are at the foot of Port San Luis, at the wharf. when the narrow gauge railroad went through, he made a deal with the narrow gauge that never traveled more than 15 miles, 20 miles an hour, but for $1.50, you could take the narrow gauge railway down to his hotel, and you could feed your family in his restaurant. The whole charge was $1.50 per person with a 9-course meal. And there was musical entertainment and local wine and everything else that he would put you up with. The Higuera grave here is the one that gives name to our main street. Liz won't mind my telling you that when I would give these tours originally, when she would hear me say Higuera, she would say, "Danny, don't be so effete." Until at age 51, she learned that that's the way you say it. You can see very modest graves because so many of these Californio families lost almost everything once the Yankees came in here and new monetary practices. They would sign promissory notes that sounded good to them. They would get a few $100s. They didn't understand what 16 or 18% interest meant, and that was the end of the line for many of these families. And so many of these graves are people born in the old sod and came here to add to the mixture of what is San Luis Obispo County. And we go on to German names like Manderscheid, Swiss-Italian names like Fiscalini, coming in after the dairy boom in the late 1860s, early 1870s, and spread throughout the county. And often intermarrying with the Portuguese who came to work in the dairies or who came to work in the shore whaling industry at Port San Luis or up at San Simeon and such. And they all fit into this wonderful matrix that we have here in San Luis Obispo County. Many of the earlier settlers married into Native American families. And people often ask, where did the Native Americans go? Well, they intermarried. That was a way of survival. And bear in mind, when the Yankees came to California, they put a bounty on the heads of Indians. They either enslaved them or wanted them dead. And so the Native Americans knew how to disappear in that way. But if you faced the immunity crises that they had, you knew by intermarrying, your children would have protection from diseases. And so Peter Forrester had a granite grave. He was not a terribly wealthy man, but he was trained in accountancy and interestingly enough, forestry for a man named Forrester. Came to the county during the quicksilver mining that went on above Cambria in the hills, and he knew how to drill mines in the soft sandstone. He is really the father of hard rock and soft rock mining in San Luis Obispo County. His work on timber and such led him to get into a partnership that became known as Crown Zellerbach. And without him, the whole mercury boom would not have been possible. And without that mercury boom, the North Coast would largely have been undeveloped area. Died very, very young, very possibly of mercury poisoning, ironically. One of the more recent burials was my sometime dear friend. I was scared of him a lot of the time, Alex Madonna. But the newspaper identified me as his good friend. I wasn't ever sure. The first time I met him, he yelled at me. See a large a rock, of course, for Alex Madonna, wouldn't it be? A large rock that has the memorial implanted into it. It has a pinkish hue. In the setting sun, it has a pinkish hue. But it's not, and by the way, we used to call that Phyllis pink. Phyllis, I did Alex's, a thing for Alex's tribute to his life for the Chamber of Commerce, one of their morning things. And I didn't know Phyllis was going to be there because I told a few stories. I wasn't sure how she would fit about it. But she let me know, be sure you tell them it was his color, not mine. Approaching the grave of Ernest Vollmer Sr., later achieved some note here in San Luis Obispo as an insurance broker. He was in partnership with Peter Bacchino, Vollmer and Bacchino Agency, the predecessor of the current Morris and Garitano Agency, the largest insurance brokerage here along the Central Coast. Ernie was a student at the University of California at Berkeley at the turn of the century. He was such a bright student that he came to the attention of President Benjamin I.D. Wheeler, who soon learned to prize Ernie's intelligence. Shortly after Teddy Roosevelt became president, a group of American businessmen came into the university along with someone from the State Department, and they said that they wanted the very brightest student they could have to go to with them to China. And Ernie came in, and they quickly saw that Ernie was exactly the person they needed to go to the seaport of Qingdao to establish a brewery. Moreover, they found out that Ernie was German-American and that he knew a great deal about brewing beer. And he was going to brew a beer in the German style for the Chinese market, which everyone thought would do quite well. He left the campus, went to China, and established the brewery. It's still the main brewery in China. It's the preferred beer in China. Then you'll find most Chinese restaurants and other restaurants feature Qingdao beer to this very day. Ernie came back from that experience, established his insurance agency in San Luis Obispo. Ernie also was the first person to offer insurance to the various agricultural operations of the Japanese American community. When the Japanese were forced out of our county by the War Relocation Act in March and April of 1942, Ernie came to the Eto family and the Nagano family in Morro Bay and said that he would watch after their business interest and their agricultural interest while they were away. And indeed, that's exactly what Ernie Vollmer and his partner Pete Bacchino did. For the Japanese American community, they were the real Santos, the saints, who, when they would come around, they would check to see that the people who were leasing the land of the Japanese Americans and Naganos and the Edos weren't abusing things too much. Both families, when they returned, found things pretty much in better shape than they ever hoped they would be, given what had happened. So Ernest Vollmer Sr. is a very, very special friend to the Asian American community of the Central Coast. This is the John Wilson grave, and the Wilsons came to this county by way of the sea. Captain Wilson was a Scot mariner in the early 19th century. He is one of the figures talked about in Richard Henry Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. It was a book that really popularized California. Captain Wilson's ship, the Ayachucho, is mentioned in 2 Years Before the Mast as the finest ship in the Pacific. And he was a very wealthy trader. He was getting along in years, meaning he was probably about 35. But that was old for those days, and he heard about a poor widow. He was docked in Santa Barbara and heard about a poor widow who had lost her husband in a battle in 1831 down in Cahenga Pass. The governor of California, who was her uncle, Juan Bautista Alvarado, was offering a sizable land grant for anyone who would marry her. She had 2 kids. She was 17 and used goods, past her prime, as Mary and Sam would have said in Little Abner. But if you marry her, well, you'll be taken care of. He got the 38,374-acre Rancho La Cañada de los Osos y Pecho Isla for that. And then he said, you know, I really admire that next valley over there, the Chorro. I'd like to, yeah, he got that too. But as a dowry, because Juan Bautista Alvarado was a little suspicious of this man who was giving up his Protestant roots, converting to Catholicism, and becoming a Mexican citizen, he established a dowry for the poor widow, Ramona Concepcion, who had lost her husband. She got the Rancho Suey, S-U-E-Y, which extends along the Santa Maria River almost to Bakersfield, one of the largest ranchos in California. So the family was fairly well off in land. Captain Wilson died in the late 1850s, and as they probated his will, there were all these children in French Oceania and other islands throughout the Pacific who came forward to make claims, and the family was pretty well impoverished by that. But he had raised Ramona's son, Romualdo Pacheco, who sometimes called Romualdo Pacheco Wilson, and Romualdo rose as an attorney for the Southern Pacific Railroad, became a leading unionist during the Civil War, which was very important for political ascension in California, and in 1875 became the only person to date of Mexican descent to become governor of California. So that comes out of that family. The poor widow, by the way, refused to live out at the ranch house on Turry Road. It's in a barn out there, and most of you have passed it without noticing that it was there. The Turries don't like us drawing a lot of attention to it. But family tradition has it that Ramona discovered the captain had a social disease. And I won't say more because there are a few children here. Well, maybe not, but either had syphilis or gonorrhea, and in the days before antibiotics. She said, "You live at the ranch house, you build me an adobe in town." So he built her a very fine adobe where the County History Center now is, and that's where she was living, and she played a major role in San Luis history at the time of the Committee of Vigilance later on. William Godwin Dana was a close friend and associate of Captain John Wilson, and like Captain John Wilson, he stopped at Santa Barbara, and just as Richard Henry Dana, when he was at the De La Guerra girls' wedding, one of the De La Guerras married into a Boston family, Dana describes that in 2 years before the mast. These girls with their dark cream-colored, how you can be dark and cream-colored, but that's the way he says it, complexions and their eyes and everything else. He fell in love, and he also knew that Uncle Juan Bautista Alvarado would take care of the family. And he wanted the Rancho Ojai. And somebody else had more political clout and got it. He got the Rancho Nipomo, again, 37,000 plus acres, and married Josefa Carreo, who produced 18 surviving children. One of the reasons why the Danas own so little land today is that they followed the inheritance principles of California, where both women and men inherited. And Captain Dana, every woman in California owes him a debt because his son-in-law, Henry Teft, who's buried here in this cemetery, who was lost at sea, was a delegate to the California Constitutional Convention in Golden Hall in Monterey in 1849. And before he left, Captain Dana said, "Now, son Teft, I want you to understand this, that this is not New England." Teft was from Maine. "This is a different part of the world. Women have rights here. They have rights of inheritance. They have rights to buy and sell property." And so in that bilingual constitution, written both in Spanish and in English, the rights of women were inculcated in that. There are some other priest graves in the cemetery. This is all filled up now. These are some of the most famous names of the American period of clergy. We have three of the early clergy buried in the church itself. Others are buried in the Franciscan Cemetery down in Santa Barbara. Father Apollinarius Roussel. Father Roussel, this is his grave, has a sister buried in the other cemetery across the way. She's buried in the Doran Pyramid. He was an English Episcopal priest before he became a Roman Catholic priest, along with his brother, who's buried next to him. She married the Doran family, high-ranking Masonic, and there was the split. A very, very interesting kind of split. But Father Roussel is important to those of us who work in restoring the old mission. He was the first one to recognize the need of preservation and began to take some action to try to keep the place from falling down. He encased it in wood to keep the adobe from melting. That probably was the wrong thing to do, but given the technology of the time, he worked with the tools he had. Father John Harnett, among other things that Father Harnett did, was to begin the serious restoration of the mission in 1934. When he arrived here, he found that the mission wall of the church itself was collapsing. It had been framed in wood to cover all the adobe errors that people didn't want to see. And of course, it continued to erode, and it was just about to fall down. He stripped it all off and rebuilt it as it is today. So the mission suddenly is transformed from looking something like a wooden New England church to the mission you see today. He built the bell tower afresh. The old three-arched bell tower that's iconic for San Luis Obispo had collapsed in 1891. There was a temporary steeple put in the garden for the bells. But Father Harnett said, we're going back to the old style that we had originally from about 1810, and he built the modern bell tower, which amazingly saved the church back in 2003. Do you remember the December 2003 San Simeon earthquake where a building collapsed in Paso Robles and such? At that time, our church suffered some crack damage, but the seismologist who looked at it with me said, you were saved by the modern reinforced annex in the rear of the church, which strengthened the walls of the church, and by this bell tower being here. It kept the mission from moving too much. So we owe Father Harnett a great deal. And the sad thing is that he was dying just as the project was being completed. He was down in St. Vincent's Hospital in 1938 when the project was completed. He was to say the first Mass in the newly restored church, but he died and is, of course, buried here. Many other priests from that time are buried here. And then I'm going to encourage you to quickly go into the mausoleum. This mausoleum was opened in 1928. And for the wealthier families of San Luis Obispo, it became the preferred place to be buried here. You'll see a lot of the most prestigious names in our county reflected in the walls of this cemetery. There's something else that I want to draw your attention to. Louis was Chinese, born in South China in the middle of the 19th century. Came to America to work for Captain John Harford, was in the gold fields for a while, eventually comes to this county and built virtually every county road built in the 19th century. The road south to the Santa Maria River, the West Cuesta Canyon Road, it's still there. It says Old Stagecoach Road, you can drive over it. Captain Cass's Wharf at Cayucas and worked for Hearst up at the San Simeon Wharf. And out in the county would have been economically far worse off than it was. Louis was a member of the Odd Fellows since 1868 when he joined. When he died in 1936, his family assumed he was going to be buried in the Odd Fellows Cemetery. The Odd Fellows opened a grave, and then the state chapter said you can't bury him there. There's an Asian exclusion law in that cemetery. No Chinese can be buried there. Louis sat on ice for 3 months at Palmer Mortuary. And the Father John Harnett, himself a dying man, he knew he did not have much time left, announced to the parishioners at the old mission that it is a Christian thing to give a person a place to be buried. And even though he was not one of us, he never came to this church, he's going to be buried here in the mausoleum. And can you imagine the amount of flack a pastor would take on? Some parishioners would be upset about it and such. But the way Father Harnett told the congregation, not one person stood up to defy him, and all Louis was buried here. And my dear friend Howard is buried right next to him. So go in there real fast before it rains and get going. Thank you for coming.